So we will talk about the lumbar vertebra. So we have 5 lumbar vertebra, and among these 5 lumbar vertebra, the first 4, that means number 1 to number 4, are known as the typical. That means they have the features. And 5th lumbar vertebra is atypical. That means it is different from the others. Now, what are the common features of the lumbar vertebra, or what are the features? By seeing those we can identify this is lumbar vertebra. Number 1, the body of the lumbar vertebra is massive and reniform in shape. Reniform means it is kidney shaped, so it is massive and reniform bodies. And number 2, there is no costal facet or absence of costal facets on the body. And by this feature we can differentiate the lumbar vertebra from the thoracic vertebra. So above the lumbar vertebra there is thoracic vertebra, and in thoracic vertebra there is presence of costal facet, but in lumbar vertebra there is absence of costal facet. Number 3, absence of transverse foramen in the transverse process of the lumbar vertebra. Number 4, which is the cardinal or unique feature of the lumbar vertebra, that is the presence of accessory body and mammillary process. Accessory process and mammillary process. These two features are absent in rest of the vertebra. So the accessory process and the mammillary process, it is the unique or very special for the lumbar vertebra. And the spinous process of the lumbar vertebra is thick and quadrilateral in shape. Now next, what is the general features of the typical lumbar vertebra? That means general features of the number 1, 2, 3 and 4 vertebra. At first come to the body. The body is massive and reniform shape or kidney shaped. Number 2, their transverse diameter is more than the anteroposterior diameter. Number 3, the size of the body increases progressively from 1st to 5th lumbar vertebra. That means the size of the first lumbar vertebra will be a little bit smaller, the second will be the bigger, third one will be the more bigger, and fourth one will be the more bigger. So the size will be increased progressively from 1st to 5th lumbar vertebra. And the body, it has no costal facets on the sides, so it is devoid of costal facet. So let's see, this is a typical lumbar vertebra, and you can see its transverse diameter is bigger than the anteroposterior diameter, and its spinous process is thick and quadrilateral in shape. Now come to the vertebral foramen. The vertebral foramen is triangular in shape, and it is larger than the thoracic vertebra but smaller than the cervical vertebra. So look at that, this is the vertebral foramen, and you can see easily this is triangular shape. So this triangular shape vertebral foramen, it is present in the lumbar vertebra, but this vertebral foramen is larger than the thoracic vertebra, but it is smaller than the cervical vertebra. Next come to the vertebral arch, that is composed of pedicle, lamina, spine, transverse process, and some superior articular process and inferior articular process. At first come to the pedicle. The pedicles are short and strong processes. In case of typical lumbar vertebra, the pedicles are short. And the lamina, these are the short, thick and broad plates. And the most important difference is on the spine. The spine or the spinous process of the typical lumbar vertebra, it is quadrilateral in shape, and it projects almost backward. You can see the spinous process is almost quadrilateral in shape. Now come to the transverse processes. The transverse processes are thin and tapering, and the posterior inferior aspect of each transverse process presents a small rough elevation called axis. So let's see the transverse process. Look at that. The transverse process is about thin, and it looks like a tapering end, and on the posterior surface of the transverse process it presents a small rough elevation which is known as the accessory process. So posterior inferior aspect of the transverse process, that is a small rough elevation which is known as accessory process. Okay. Now come to the superior articular process. The superior articular process, here the posterior border, it is marked by another rough elevation which is known as mammillary process. So this accessory process and mammillary process, these are the two unique feature of the lumbar vertebra. So let's see the mammillary process on the superior articular process. So this is the superior articular process, and on the posterior surface there is another rough elevation which is known as the mammillary process. Now come to the so that's all about a typical lumbar vertebra. Now let's see again. So this is the body of the typical lumbar vertebra. We told you that the transverse diameter is larger than the anteroposterior diameter, and the body is reniform shaped or kidney shaped. Now come to the pedicle. We told you the pedicle is short. Look at that, the pedicle is short and stronger, and the transverse process is thin and it is tapering, and on the posterior surface of the transverse process there was a small rough elevation which is known as the accessory process. And we told you about the spine. The spine is about quadrilateral in shape and is directed backwards, and the superior articular process, it contains another rough elevation which is known as the mammillary process. And this is all about the typical thoracic vertebra. Now we will start the atypical lumbar vertebra. So the atypical lumbar vertebra, so it will have some differences from the typical lumbar vertebra. At first come to the transverse processes. The transverse processes of the atypical lumbar vertebra, that means L5 vertebra, it has thick, short and pyramidal in shape. And the spinal or the spinous process is small and shorter than the typical lumbar vertebra, and the body is the largest of all lumbar vertebra. So the L5 lumbar vertebra, the body has the largest diameter. So let's see. Look at that. We told you that transverse process is thicker and shorter in case of L5, but in case of the typical lumbar vertebra, the transverse process was narrower and thinner. And the spinous process is, look at that, it is much shorter in length than the typical lumbar vertebra. And the body will be the largest. That means L1 will be the smallest body, and the L5 will have the largest body. So the largest body, the lumbar 5 vertebra or atypical vertebra, has the largest body. And here you can say a table. So this is the summary of all the features of a lumbar vertebra. So you can read it from here also. Now we will learn the attachment of the lumbar vertebra. So at first come to the anteriorly. Anteriorly there is attachment of the anterior longitudinal ligament, which is attached in the upper and lower border of the lumbar vertebra anteriorly. So anteriorly, in the upper border and lower border of the body, there is attachment of the anterior longitudinal ligament. And posteriorly on the body, there will be attachment of the posterior longitudinal ligament. And one thing, while we studied the diaphragm, we told you that the right crus diaphragm and left crus of the diaphragm, they are attached up to the lumbar vertebra. So you can see the right crus of the diaphragm, it is attached up to the front of the upper 3 lumbar vertebral bodies. So up to the L3, there will be attachment of the right crus of the diaphragm on the right side, and left crus of the diaphragm, it is attached on the body of the lumbar vertebra up to L2. So the right crus of the diaphragm is attached up to lumbar 3 vertebral body, and ref crus of the diaphragm is attached up to the lumbar 2 vertebra of the lumbar 2 vertebra. Now, next the muscle is attached, that is psoas major, which is arised from the upper and lower border of the all lumbar vertebra. That is the psoas major muscle. The psoas major muscle, it arises by some fleshy slits from the upper and lower border of the all lumbar vertebra. So this is psoas major muscle. Now let's see the thoracolumbar fascia, where it is attached. The thoracolumbar fascia, it has 3 layers. It is a fascia, it has 3 layers: anterior layer, medial layer, and posterior layer. The anterior layer of the thoracolumbar fascia, it is attached on the faint ridge on the front of the transverse process. You can see arises from a front ridge on the front of the transverse process. Now I come to the medial layer. The medial layer is attached at the tip of the transverse process, and the posterior layer of the thoracolumbar fascia, which is marking by the green line, it is attached at the tip of the spinous process. Now, while we studied the sacrum, we studied about 2 muscles, that is the multifidus muscle and electrospinal muscle. These 2 muscles, look at that, they are attached to the spinous process of the lumbar vertebra. They are attached on the lateral part of the spinous process of the lumbar vertebra. And last of all, the medial and lateral arcuate ligament, they are attached. The medial and lateral arcuate ligament of the D diaphragm, they are attached to the tip of the transverse process of the lumbar 1 vertebra, which is not shown here. So medial and lateral arcuate ligament, they are attached at the tip of the transverse process of the lumbar vertebra. Tip of the transverse process of the first lumbar vertebra, especially the first lumbar vertebra. So that's all about the lumbar vertebra, their attachment. And